At certain points in history, WWE's booking team have failed to give fans what they wanted, but this has not always been the case. No, far from it. In fact, there have been plenty of times where the WWE has listened to its fans and given them exactly what they were looking for. But just what are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the man of the hour, Cody Rhodes. Yes, after leaving WWE behind in 2016, it seemed unlikely we'd ever see Cody Rhodes inside of a Vince McMahon-owned ring ever again. And this became especially true when, in 2019, he helped to form All Elite Wrestling. But proving the adage that you can never say never in wrestling, it was in 2022 that Cody decided to leave AEW behind and instead return to the place he had once called home again. How would he be received by fans? Very well. After all, by this point, everyone knew how good the American Nightmare could be. And it appeared Vince McMahon realized this too, as in what will probably rank as the last good thing he ever did for the company, he pushed Cody hard following his re-debut at WrestleMania 38. Sure, injury would stall the grandson of a plumber for a while, and then there was the fact that once he returned from that injury, the corporate landscape of WWE had changed dramatically. But in the end, none of this would slow down the rise of Rhodes for too long. No, he'd still go into the main event of WrestleMania 39 as the challenger for Roman Reigns' undisputed WWE Universal title. And then he lost. Yes, it was a move most fans disliked at the time. Hell, this became especially worrying when, after winning the 2024 Royal Rumble, Cody came out to the ring on an episode of SmackDown and gave away his WrestleMania rematch against the Tribal Chief to The Rock. Needless to say then, this caused something of a backlash to develop amongst fans. But quick to recognize this backlash and address it, WWE pivoted at that point and reinstated the American Nightmare into the main event. What happened after that? Well, the company's new top babyface went on to beat Roman and become the new WWE champion himself, with this continuing to be a position he holds to this day. And given how great the WWE business is doing right now, with them currently in the middle of their biggest hot streak in decades, we can only assume that fans are happy with how things all turned out, and that they remain happy to see Cody on top. But this wasn't the first time a fan backlash led to WWE having to change their WrestleMania plans at the last minute. No, exactly 10 years earlier, the exact same thing had happened when Daniel Bryan and the Yes Movement came along. Yes, for many lapsed fans from the turn of the millennium, this was the moment that got them back into wrestling. Either that or another popular push we'll get to later. But then why wouldn't it be? Because back during the early 2010s, there was no wrestler on the planet more beloved by audiences than Daniel Bryan. Not that WWE saw things this way though. No, considering the American Dragon was under 6 feet in height and didn't have that bodybuilder physique, the company saw a very definitive ceiling on what he'd be able to achieve, with this ceiling being the mid-card. And that would all result in a war breaking out between Vince McMahon and his own fan base as crowds began hijacking shows all throughout 2013 and the early part of 2014, drowning out everything else with a sea of yes chants. Of course, many fans thought WWE were going to respond to this by simply pushing Daniel Bryan to the moon right away, but this wasn't the way things went. And that only led to the backlash getting bigger and bigger as each week passed. Hell, the whole thing would reach something of a climax at the 2014 Royal Rumble, as that was when, after the Washington native wasn't even included in the titular bout, a situation would develop, with this causing the company to start looking inward and reassess things. And so it was that as WrestleMania 30 neared closer, the boss realized there was simply no way he could go with his planned main event of Randy Orton versus Dave Bautista. Now, if he tried that, it was only going to lead to a disaster. So instead, he decided to pull the trigger and add Daniel Bryan to the match at the last second. And not just that, he'd actually have the American Dragon win the whole thing and walk out of the night World Heavyweight Champion. That's right, it was one of the greatest stories WWE ever told, and one of the most cathartic moments of joy for any wrestling fan watching at the time, as the sight of Bryan Danielson holding both world titles above his head at the end of the show felt like more than just a win for him, it felt like a win for us too, as our voices were finally being heard. But what about the inverse situation to the Yes Movement? The time Daniel Bryan became the villain putting the beloved fan favorite over? Well, that would come a few years later in 2019 when Kofi Kingston and Kofi Mania reigned supreme. Now, Kofi Kingston was always someone who fans liked. In fact, as far back as his beginning in the WWE during the late 2000s, he was always over and always got great reactions whenever he came out to the ring to do his thing. But like with Daniel Bryan, there was a definite ceiling on where WWE thought Kofi could go, with this once again being the mid-card. And so that was why for the first decade or so of his career, Kofi would remain in that spot, often having decent things to do, but never being treated like the true superstar he could be. And then 2019 came along. That was when, after Mustafa Ali got injured and had to be pulled from that February's Elimination Chamber pay-per-view, Kofi Kingston would be brought in to sub for him as a last-minute replacement. And there, in that bout, Kofi would put on such a star-making performance, at one point taking WWE Champion Daniel Bryan to the absolute limit, that fans suddenly remembered how great he could be. Obviously, you can see where this is going then. Yes, over the next couple of months, Kofi Mania became a big thing in WWE as Kingston's stock rose dramatically in a short pace of time. Hell, fans simply wouldn't be content anymore unless their guy was put into a world title match against the American Dragon at WrestleMania 35. And luckily for those fans, this time WWE were a lot more open to listening to them and changing plans accordingly, which was exactly what led us to a situation where, at the Showcase of the Immortals on April 7th, 2019, the New Day member finally got his shot at the gold, and like a true hero of the people, he ended up giving the fans what they wanted by winning it. To say that this is one of the greatest WrestleMania moments ever then would be an understatement. Really, it couldn't have worked out better if the company had tried. But as it happened, that wasn't the only push fans were begging for, which climaxed at WrestleMania 35. No, over in the women's division at the same time, the exact same situation was playing itself out with another unlikely top star in Becky Lynch. Now, Becky Lynch was always good, but if you were watching back during the mid-2010s when the rise of the Four Horsewomen happened, it was clear she was never meant to be the main star. No, out of all the members of that stable, she was arguably dead last in the pecking order, with WWE always putting a lot more stock in Charlotte Flair, Sasha Banks, and Bayley. That was until 2018. What happened here? Well, something very interesting, as following a couple of months of slowly building up a bit of a win streak, Becky found herself in the spot of challenger to Carmella's SmackDown Women's title at August 19th SummerSlam. The only problem with this, though, was that despite fighting hard to earn that spot, before the match happened, Charlotte Flair would also be inserted into the bout. And when the Queen went on to win that match and take Lynch's big moment away from her, this led to fans being upset. So those same fans started betting behind the Irish woman in an even bigger way at this point then, even after Becky attacked Charlotte following the bout in what was supposed to be an official heel turn. A heel turn which WWE continued to try and push for a few weeks thereafter. To be fair though, the company did realize after those few weeks had passed that fans had no interest in booing Becky Lynch. No, they saw her as the hero of the situation. And this led to things pivoting as, now instead of being the heel, Lynch became a Steve Austin-esque anti-authority rebel, someone who dressed exclusively in black and who now called herself the Man. And what a success this character would turn out to be for everyone involved, because so over would Becky get, she'd at one point be pushed as the top star in the entirety of WWE, with this being the first time in history a woman had been pushed as the biggest name in the industry. Obviously then, this set her down a path of becoming women's champion at WrestleMania 35, but it wouldn't just be Charlotte Flair she'd be facing here. No, it would also be former UFC bantamweight champion Ronda Rousey. And what's more, this match wouldn't just be to see who'd be crowned the undisputed WWE Women's Champion, but it would also be the main event of the granddaddy of them all, with this being the first time the women had ever main evented WrestleMania. Would Becky win that match? Of course she would. And in doing so, she'd cap off one of the best stories of WWE's modern era. Then once that was over, she'd continue on as one of the company's top draws, with this being something she continues to do to this day, even if she is currently on a sabbatical. Will her sabbatical end with her returning to WWE and regaining her spot as the Man? More than likely, yes. And if she does, that will mean she can return to working with an old friend of hers, someone who had a beloved push of his own in 2022 and 2023. Who are we talking about here? Why, Sami Zayn, of course. Yes, if you've been watching WWE during this current hot period they're in, then you'll be all too aware that one of the key factors in them getting hot again was Sami Zayn. And that's because in late 2022, he became the most unlikely hero ever when he joined the Bloodline and turned that angle into an all-time classic. Not that those in the know weren't aware Sami could be a great hero prior to this, of course. No, back during his runs in places like Ring of Honor, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, and even NXT, he'd gotten massively over as a fan favorite. That said, once he joined the WWE main roster in 2015, things wouldn't always go so well for him. Why was this? Well, Vince McMahon just never saw the Quebec native as being a top guy, with this being exactly why, during his early interactions with the Bloodline in 2022, he was never even seen on screen with Roman Reigns. But that would all change when Vince was ousted for the first time that summer, with this leading to Triple H being put in charge of creative, someone who was a lot more open to pushing Zayn. So it was that we got some true magic when, after becoming something of an annoyance to the tribal chief for a while, Sami eventually worked his way into the Bloodline's heart and became their honorary Uso. And this led to fans falling in love with him more than they ever had before, as his goofy puppy dog charms became too much to ignore. Yes, we all knew his time in the heel group was going to come to an end eventually, likely with him being a victim of a beatdown from Roman and company. But after a while, many fans began to hope that, when this did finally happen, it would be Zayn who would be the one to take the belt off of the head of the table. So when Sami did the proactive thing and turned on Roman at the 2023 Royal Rumble then, the pop was nuclear. And this turned him into the biggest babyface in the entire wrestling industry heading into his big undisputed WWE Universal title match against the champ at February 18th's Elimination Chamber, an event held live from his home province of Quebec. Would Sami win this one? Unfortunately for him, no. But at least he would remain over enough after the fact. And because he remained so over, he'd be given the consolation prize of teaming up with his best friend Kevin Owens at WrestleMania 39 to beat the Usos for the undisputed WWE Tag Team titles. That's right, even if it wasn't by winning the world title, Zayn still got to play his part in helping to bring the Bloodline down on the grandest stage of them all. But one of the men he beat that night wouldn't always be on the heel side of the spectrum. No, less than a year later, he'd find himself being the babyface fans desperately wanted to see get pushed. That's right, it's time for us to talk about the meteoric rise of Jey Uso. Yes, few fans saw this one coming. After all, for the first decade plus of his career, Jey Uso was someone who was considered a lifetime tag team act alongside his brother Jimmy. And while they were both over, the fact that WWE always put a ceiling on tag team wrestling meant there was only so high the pair were going to go. But then the Bloodline angle happened, with this all pretty much starting with Jey Uso taking up a singles role for the first time by stepping up to his tribal chief, Roman Reigns. And while he wouldn't defeat Roman here and would end up bending the knee to him, come 2023, those old frustrations with his spot would have risen again, with this leading to Jey Uso breaking away on his own once more. Now though, with 3 years of the Bloodline angle to help him feel like a much bigger deal, fans were no longer willing to accept Jey as a mid-carder. No, they wanted him to be a main eventer instead. And so it was that after being shipped over to Raw during the 2023 draft and separated from the rest of his family in the process, the youngest Uso was finally allowed to thrive in such a spot. Sure, he wouldn't be winning world titles or anything like that, but main event Jey Uso was always in a prominent spot on the card, whether that be by partnering up with Cody Rhodes or even by getting involved in that year's War Games match as a babyface. Still, for as much success as he was having now, one thing which still eluded Jey was some singles gold. Luckily though, this would be rectified when, after beating his brother Jimmy in a one-on-one bout at WrestleMania 40 Night 1, he'd then go on to challenge Braun Breaker for the Intercontinental title on the September 23rd episode of Raw and beat him to take home his first piece of solo hardware. That's right, finally Jey Uso could call himself a champion on his own. And while he has since lost that belt back to Braun, the very fact that he was able to win it in the first place proves just how far he has risen and how far he's still capable of rising yet. Does this mean a world title run is in his future? It's possible. But Jey isn't the only current fan favorite in WWE who's still chasing that first world title win. No, the same thing could be said about our next subject too. A man who fans really got behind in a big way over the last year or two, LA Knight. Yeah. Seriously, there's been perhaps no one else in recent WWE memory who's broke out as a cult hit in quite the way that LA Knight has. And that's something of a miracle in many ways because for the vast majority of his career, he was semi-hidden away in smaller leagues like TNA or the NWA, with never looking like he was ever going to get his shot in the big leagues. Sure, he would eventually get signed to the WWE in 2021, and from there be sent down to NXT, where he got acclimated to the WWE way of doing things. But any positive he gained there seemed to be washed away as soon as he was called up to the main roster and repackaged as Max Dupree, manager of the Maximum Male Models. Yes, this group were never exactly a main event act, and as their manager, Max Dupree was never going to go far. Thankfully for him though, once Vince McMahon left power in 2022, Triple H would see a lot more in the Hagerstown native, with this being what led him to turn Knight back into his original NXT gimmick, and from there show what he could do on the mic each and every week. And so good would LA Knight be on the mic, with him basically coming across like a throwback cross between The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin, it wouldn't take long for main roster audiences to start getting behind him en masse. In fact, by the time the summer of 2023 came around, you could have made the solid argument that he was amongst the most over people on the entire roster. And when we were talking about a roster which included the likes of Roman Reigns, Cody Rhodes, Sami Zayn, and more here, that's quite an achievement. Would this all lead to world title success for the boy from Maryland? Not quite, though he would get his chance to challenge the tribal chief for the big boy belt at November 4th, 2023's Crown Jewel. That said, his push would remain strong anyway, with him remaining in the upper mid-card lower main event spot, something which fans were very happy with as he'd, by this point, become a true superstar in their eyes. And by the time SummerSlam came around in August of 2024, he'd be fully rewarded for all his hard work by being booked to beat Logan Paul for the United States title, with this being his first main roster title win. Where will LA Knight go from here? Well, considering he's recently lost his United States title, we'd love to see him challenging for the world title again at some point. And if he ever does win that world title, it'll put him in the same category as a hero of his, someone who also had a meteoric rise based on fan response alone back during the mid to late 90s. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Stone Cold Steve Austin? After all, he was in many ways the original example of fan demand causing plans to change in WWF. And that's because in 1996, while the company was still very much in the mindset that good guys had to be noble warriors and bad guys had to be evil cheaters, audiences were beginning to appreciate the shades of gray more and more. So when Austin came along as a trash-talking, ass-kicking Texan who won his matches by any means necessary, even if those means involved being a villain, fans quickly fell in love with him. But then why wouldn't they? Because back in 1996, Steve Austin was just about the coolest guy on planet Earth. And the rebel spirit that he had didn't get any dimmer as 1997 came around. So realizing they were fighting the current by trying to keep him as the dastardly heel, WWF decided to go with a whole new paradigm and embrace the era of the anti-hero. When at WrestleMania 13, in the greatest double turn ever and one of the greatest wrestling matches ever put on, Austin and his chief rival Bret Hart switched places, with Austin becoming the babyface and the Hitman becoming the heel. Not that this would suddenly mean the Rattlesnake was shaking hands or kissing babies now or anything. No, he'd keep those heelish aspects to himself that had first gotten him over. It's just that now they would be treated less like the actions of a villain and more like the actions of a hero who did exactly what he wanted when he wanted. His boss's wishes be damned. And that made him the biggest star the wrestling industry had ever seen then, as turn of the millennium audiences couldn't get enough of seeing him beat up Vince McMahon on a weekly basis. Really, you could argue this is the prime example of WWE going with a push that fans were demanding, and it worked out great for them, as were it not for Austin's rise, the company might not even be here today. And if WWE goes out of business in 1997 and WCW imploded a few years later, where does that leave the wrestling industry today? Hell, there's every likelihood we never would have gotten our next subject entering the industry, someone who was a massive fan of Stone Cold back in the day. And as it happens, in 2011, this person would also get their own anti-hero rise to the top, one which was fueled by fan demand. Yes, we're talking about CM Punk. Yes, back in the late 2000s, CM Punk was one of the most beloved performers out there, an indie darling if you will, and this led to many WWE fans who were growing more and more frustrated with the on-screen product by the week to see in him a hope for a better future. Of course, at the time, it seemed there was little chance that this was going to lead to a major push for Phil Brooks. That was until he came out to the ring on the June 27, 2011 episode of Raw, screwed John Cena out of a victory, then walked up to the top of the ramp, sat down cross-legged, and proceeded to cut the promo of a lifetime. Yes, this was the famous Pipe Bomb, a scorched earth mic segment where Punk would shatter the fourth wall by trashing everyone and everything behind the scenes. And in doing this, he instantly became the voice of the voiceless, a hero to a whole generation of fans who were thinking the same thing as him. Yes, it's true that the Pipe Bomb was supposed to be a heel promo on Punk's part, but no one was going to boo him after that. And so it was that when he walked into Money in the Bank a few weeks later to challenge John Cena for the WWF title in his home city of Chicago, he was treated like a returning hero, someone who was going to save the industry and lead it into a glorious third boom period. Did this end up happening? Not exactly, and the botching of the second summer of Punk would end up being one of the reasons the Second City Saint quit WWE a few years later in a wave of ill feeling. But even if he never became the megastar he could have been back then, Punk still got massively over, as before he left, he'd hold on to the WWE title for a full 434 days, a modern record at the time. And all the while he was doing this, fans were behind him every step of the way, loving the fact that their guy was getting a push to the top of the card. Hell, even today, CM Punk is able to remain over as a hero to many fans, largely on account of how hot he was back in 2011. But what about a former rival of his? Didn't he get a surprising but fan-approved push all the way to the top at 1.2 back in 2008? Why, yes he did. And that's why our next subject is none other than Jeff Hardy. Jeff Hardy is one of those guys who really could have been the biggest star in all of wrestling back in the late 2000s, because with his alternative vibe and eye-catching high-risk moveset, he was over with just about every wrestling fan there was back then. Really, the only thing that ever held him back were his own personal issues, with this stopping him from ever really truly becoming the guy. That said, back in 2008, there was a brief period where this looked like it wouldn't be an issue, as that was a time when he was not only clean, but also at the peak of his drawing power. Seriously, as the 2000s were drawing to an end, Jeff Hardy was starting to outsell John Cena at the merch stands, something that would have seemed unthinkable for many until it happened. And this wave of momentum the charismatic Enigma was riding at that point would soon see fans start to demand he be pushed all the way to the top of the card. Thankfully then, WWE would be willing to listen to their audience on this occasion. And so that was why, throughout 2008, he'd begin staking his claim at becoming WWE Champion. Sure, it wouldn't happen for him right away. No, before he reached the mountaintop, Jeff would have to fail a couple of times, but by the time Armageddon came around on December 14th of that year, he'd finally be able to send the crowd home happy when he beat Edge and Triple H in a triple threat match to win the big one. And when we say fans were sent home happy here, we mean it, because this represented one of the great feel-good WWE title wins of all time from a guy who many thought would never make it to that spot at all. So now that he was the champion, would Jeff Hardy usurp John Cena as the face of the company and go on his own decade-long run on top? No, unfortunately, because pretty soon after he won the gold, his personal issues would start to resurface, contributing towards him leaving the WWE altogether in the summer of 2009. But while that was disappointing, none of it changed the fact that for a brief moment there, fans felt like they'd be able to play a part in pushing the youngest Hardy brother all the way to the top of the card, where he deserved to be. Even today, in fact, while he might not be in a top guy spot anymore, he remains one of the more popular wrestlers out there. And that's true no matter where he's plied his craft over the last few years, whether that be WWE, AEW, or TNA. But then we guess that just goes to show what pushing someone when the fans are demanding it can do for a person's career, and how much it can keep those fans coming back for more in the decades which follow.